plenary to examine British involvement in the Iraq War. Some of the issues addressed in this portion are military readiness and the lack of equipment for British troops during the war. This is 2 hours, 15 minutes.
Sir Martin Gilbert is unable to be with us this afternoon. He has to attend at short notice a very close friend's funeral, and he sends his apologies to the witness and to the audience. So with that, let's resume the questioning, and Roderick.
I'd just like to talk fairly briefly about the military campaign itself before I think Sir Lawrence wants to go into some more specialised aspects. Basically, the campaign went extraordinarily well. Was over much quicker than anticipated. Is that right?
I think so, yes. I mean, I think an extraordinary combination of very high technology and basic successful soldiering.
Was part of the reason it went so fast that the other side put up less of a fight than had been expected?
I think the planning for what was described by the Americans as effects-based warfare was very successful. They were able to target with astonishing quite quickly. Large numbers of Iraqi soldiers in various places simply went home.
Had the coalition's military intelligence about the enemy turned out to be accurate?
Not entirely, because I was certainly led to believe that the Republican Guard in particular was a relatively sophisticated and effective military unit. But I think what it demonstrated, perhaps in contrast with the first Gulf War, that the advances in technology and precision bombing in particular was something that more conventional forces, like the Iraqi forces, albeit of much bigger size, simply could not resist.
So by the 1st of May, we get to a situation where it is declared that the mission has been accomplished.
Well, the warfighting phase.
Yes. And what was your reaction at that point? Did you actually think that the main task was over or still ahead?
I don't think I'd put the emphasis on one side or the other. I think, as you say, a lot had been achieved very successfully in probably a shorter time than we anticipated. But I think we were always well aware that in any conflict, the post-conflict period is always going to be longer and more difficult.
And one of the things it did allow, as you were telling us this morning, was for us to plan to draw down quite significant numbers of the troops that we deployed in the campaign.
Yeah.
What
to
influence?
About a third, I think, was the figure.
Yeah. What governed that decision? How quickly you did it, and what point you drew down to?
Well, I think if we go back to the discussion we had before lunch about the size of the force that we could deploy, one of the consequences of deploying force on any operation is that they then have to have a period of recuperation, of recovery. They actually have to get back into their training cycle. It's something that I didn't, frankly, entirely understand when I first got to the Ministry of Defence. We were discussing earlier the no-fly zones. I assumed before I went to Kuwait to talk to the people involved that flying missions over southern Iraq was pretty good training. But of course it was only part of their training, and it meant that they could not get back to the more encompassing training that was required. And similarly with forces who had engaged in warfighting, they had got to get back into their normal routine of training and deployment when the time came. So the sooner we got them back from their warfighting role, the sooner they could resume their normal activities.
Down in the southeast, as we discussed this morning, we found ourselves in charge of 4 provinces, and we discussed a bit the way in which this wasn't fully anticipated. Had we actually, in the original military plan, anticipated that British forces would be taking Basra, or was it going to be our role to screen it for the American advance?
Well, we had anticipated that we would be taking responsibility. I think the point I was making was that I certainly had expected that others would come in to assist more quickly than they did, so that it wasn't purely a military responsibility, as it proved to be for rather longer than I had expected. Certainly, we were likely to always have been responsible for taking Basra, because the essential American plan was to move as quickly as possible to Baghdad, and if necessary, although it proved not to be, but if necessary, to bypass some of the cities on the way, because they regarded Baghdad as a key center psychologically and practically of the regime.
And looking back, finally, on this successful campaign, what would you, with reflection, have preferred to do differently?
In the warfighting part?
Yes, in the warfighting part.
I'm not sure that there was a huge difference that I would have made. I mean, the warfighting part was remarkably successful. We sustained some casualties, but by and large, it was a success. I suspect, I think Sir John made reference to an observation by Jeremy Greenstock. One of the difficulties of advancing at that speed, in contrast to a more conventional campaign, was that the resistance that was left in the wake of the front line was able to attack not the front line, not the sort of hard-end combat forces, but some of the people who were not so much in the rear, but almost at the side. So some of the attacks by, I think that we called them the Fedayeen at one stage, some of those loyal to Saddam Hussein, were on, I think they took some American prisoners who were mechanics. I think a chef was taken prisoner. I mean, they were able to sort of come into the side of the advance, and perhaps those people were not as well protected as might have been the case, because in a conventional campaign, essentially the front line would have taken all of the resistance with it. I think that may have been an issue. I think, though, that actually the real issue was that those who were ultimately loyal to Saddam Hussein were not necessarily wearing uniforms, so they were not capable of being dealt with in a conventional military way.
But no big lessons to be learned from the warfighting part of the campaign?
No, I think I mentioned some of them. I think the big lessons, by and large, were very, certainly for the Ministry of Defence, were very positive ones, and they were to do with the benefits of very sophisticated technology, precision bombing, precision attacks, the way in which modern warfare can be conducted, the warfighting part with a relatively smaller number of soldiers as against the kind of force that was originally anticipated in the original American plan for invading Iraq.
Sorry. Yes, I'm going to ask you a few questions on intelligence, weapons of mass destruction dossier, and then go on to the much larger questions for you, possibly, of the defence budget and some equipment issues. So if we start with weapons of mass destruction and the intelligence. Now, in the Ministry of Defence, you have Defence Intelligence staff, which is bound to be a major input into the JIC process. Did you get separate briefings from the Defence Intelligence staff on Iraqi issues, including the issues of weapons of mass destruction?
Yes.
How sort of regularly were you being updated on that?
I'm not sure I can put a figure on it, but pretty often. I mean, there were regular papers produced by DIS looking at issues like weapons of mass destruction, but a range of other issues to do with, for example, military capability. I think at one stage I did ask whether I could be given information about to follow on from Sir Roderick's previous questions, about the resilience of the Iraqi armed forces. What kind of capabilities did they have? Were they likely to fight, and what was their likely effectiveness? So the DIs were involved not simply in the pure intelligence part, but more in their assessment of military capability.
Exactly.